Accord principal ODM leader earlier on talking matters corruption as well as the ongoing voter registration exercise. Joining me now in studio to talk more about what the former PM said is Charles Wafula. He's a political analyst. Charles, thank you for joining us on News Center. So let's begin with just what we've heard right now. You know, Raila Odinga talking about and citing the example of Nigeria and the kind of action that has been taken there. 5 governors already in prison. And we had the president last year say he's done what he knows how to do, perhaps gone above and beyond, even saying at great political expense, firing some in his cabinet, that he cannot be the one to imprison or sentence somebody. There are processes and independent institutions in place. So what do you make of that criticism of the government in fighting graft?
Well, thank you, Sophie, for having me. First of all, of course, we have to say that, yes, indeed, it's the job of the opposition and any other patriotic Kenyan to call out the government, to point out issues of corruption, pilferage, misappropriation of public funds. So, rightly so. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. Number two, when it comes to issues of the extent to which the government has fought corruption, it then again becomes a game of perception, because a street-level Kenyan interprets the government's commitment to fight corruption to the extent that major public figures have been arrested, arraigned in court, and jailed. So that hasn't happened in Kenya, from way back. But for me, I think one of the things I must note, Sophie, is that I see cycles of fighting corruption in Kenya. From way back up until 2003, there was no accountability and there was no transparency. After 2003 coming up to now, there's a greater sense of transparency. You would hear these stories coming out and claims and counterclaims and, people sort of at least even sometimes owning up that, yes, X money went through my account. Those are things you wouldn't hear from then. So my sense is that we now need to move forward from now some bit of transparency and lack of accountability to both having transparency and accountability, whereby we now move to holding to account those who have been cited and, of course, proven to have been involved in corruption.
So from where you stand, Raila says that Kenya is heading to the League of Failed States. And he cited that Transparency International Index at position 145 out of 171, top 20 most corrupt, technically, in as far as Kenya is concerned. So you're saying there has been progress.
Yes.
So then would you agree with this statement?
Yeah, I agree because, the immediate former chair of ESCC, Kinisu, said that we lose about 300 billion per year. Other estimates put it at about a quarter of the total national annual budget. So if you're doing 1.6 trillion, that's just about 400 billion. So it's a lot of money supposedly being lost. And my definition of a failed state is twofold. A failed state is a situation whereby we can have a state collapse, where places like, say, Somalia, what's happened there, or when the state is complicit in perpetuating crimes against its people. That's also another way of defining a failed state. And so when you look at Kenya and ask yourself how much is the government doing to either stop or promote corruption, the government begins to be on the fence, and we don't see a lot of decisive action. Why also? Because, Sophia, the fight against corruption in Kenya is usually done through political lenses. It's about survival. And those holding office asking themselves, on whose toes am I stepping? And what is the ramification of that step? And that, I think, in a very great sense, hinders the fight against corruption. Yeah.
And always questions have been raised, where really is the ball being dropped? Because the fight against graft is complex. It's not a, one-off as the president to go do this. There are institutions, independent ones to say so. And the Attorney General last year talked about the judiciary being the one dropping the ball. From where you sit, where do you think we're losing it?
It has always been my sense that the anti-corruption czar, the chief, is supposed to be the president. He's supposed to lead from the front. And he has shown signs of doing that. But at times, when people from his side of the coalition come under heavy attack, you don't see him coming out as strongly. I also understand, because it's an issue of also looking at the coming elections and seeing how that will upset the apple cart. ordinarily you would expect two things: either a president who fights corruption in his first term, ready to lose the next election, or to pussyfoot about fighting corruption in the first term in the hope that once he's re-elected to a last term, then he can come out all guns blazing because he's got nothing to lose. He owes no one nothing.
Yeah.
So that's my sense. And there's that political side, which I think is very important, and it has a powerful ability to disrupt any effort to fight corruption. I mean, think of a very prominent minister who's been arraigned in court, and then the cases just drags for so long, and there are always all these injunctions and all these games that are being played in between here to slow down the wheels of justice. But also that those who are presiding over these cases, and we've seen in the recent past, the CJ Magara put out his plan, and sort of just trying to show how quickly cases will move, but more importantly that there's the creation of an anti-corruption sort of division within the judiciary, which will specifically focus on that. And so it's something to watch and see how fast that will pan out as we go along. Yeah.
And also raised concern about some $800 million US dollars that the government apparently intends to borrow to pay off her debt. And the concern there would be, as this money is being borrowed, will it actually go to paying off the debt, or what would your concern be?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, history is not on our side with respect to that issue. And when you look at Kenya's debt to GDP ratio, we are not doing very well. We need to work harder in terms of restructuring our debts against the backdrop of what we are getting as a nation in terms of the revenue. We're not doing very well at that. I think we're spending probably almost up to about, 20 shillings against 100 bob to pay our debt. So a lot more has to be done with respect to that. But absolutely my belief is that eyes need to be trained on the money that the government will borrow to repay this debt. But borrowing to repay debt is not unique. It's something that has been happening before. However, I think it goes back to what you're asking, that will this money meet its intended objective or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So this week, Kenya dropped 6 places in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index from 139 in 2015 to 145 in 2016 with 26 points. Samuel Kimeu is the Transparency International Director. He's on phone with us also on this particular subject we're discussing today, state of corruption, as the conversation was started earlier this morning, not started, but continued by Raila Odinga in that press conference. Kimeu, thank you for making time for News Center. So Kenya dropping several positions to now 145. What does this really mean? Talk to us about the implication of this.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Basically, the implication for this is that whatever rhetoric, whatever efforts that have been put in place are yet to register on the index to show that there is really improvement. The long and short of it is that we have the best methods in the fight against corruption for the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years now.
All right, I'm sorry, but the line appears to be having a bit of trouble. So as they fix that, let me bring this back to studio. And of course, corruption is not something new that we're talking about here in Kenya. We have in the past, here on KTN had the graft diaries because of the numerous times there are several scandals coming up. What do you think will be that silver bullet in as far as the fight against graft, if at all one exists?
I like the rider, if at all, because indeed it's a difficult question in terms of having a silver bullet. Why? Because also corruption in and of itself mutates. There are always creative ways you put in place. For instance, in 2004, the Public Procurement Oversight Act, fellows come up with newer ways of circumventing the law. So there's got to be always that spin around it. But I think for me, Sophia, corruption in Kenya, in my opinion, starts at election financing. Why? Because the perpetrators of corruption usually finance the people who will take over government, ostensibly for, of course, to access new opportunities, but also to get their protection. If we're able to fix, to a great extent, the issues around election financing, that will help, I think, curb a large extent of the mega corruption that takes place in this country.
Yeah. I understand we have back on the line Kenya's Transparency International Director, that's the Kenyan chapter of Transparency International. Kimeu, thank you for staying with us. I hope we can now be able to hear you. So we're talking about the implication of this findings, Kenya at 145. When the former Prime Minister says that Kenya is now in the league of failing states because she's top 20 most corrupt countries in the world, do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, I would agree that as a country we are not doing well. We have not been doing well for quite some time, and at the moment it's a source of concern because there has been a lot of rhetoric about the fight against corruption in the last 2 years.
All right. And reading the report by Transparency International, they talked about even when there are laws that have been put in place, and we have seen, bills being passed, now we have them as acts to fight corruption. We have a multi-agency in place as well to ensure that all the agencies are coming together to fight graft. Aren't these things that would see Kenya progress? Why do you think we dropped?
Well, a caution. Statistics relate to the last 1 year, and that it could take a bit of time before some positives or negatives could be from the index. But having said that, our failure, our dropping in the index is basically a function of how serious we have been in the fight against corruption, and to the extent that we pile scandals upon scandals, and we don't have. We are not resolving scandals that already exist, is a sign of worry, because the concerns with Kenyans and a lot of business people in this country is that all these scandals, in the end, will break us down if we don't find a way of resolving them. And it also inspires a new generation of young people who then think that our system is incapable of holding them to account, and if they engage in corruption, they can get away with it. This can only make things worse for this country.
All right. Thank you, Samuel Kimeu, Director of Transparency International Kenya, for joining us here at News Center. Let me come back to you, Charles, as we bring this to a close, because corruption was not the only matter that Raila Odinga talked about earlier today. He touched on the mass voter registration exercise, and some of the issues therein from, attempts to rig the election, that young people under 18s were being registered to vote. We've heard him say the NIS is bringing outsiders to register as voters to pump up the ruling Jubilee's numbers. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister and his coalition are competitors in the next election. Obviously, they would want to have a level field of playing. You have heard His Excellency, the Deputy President Ruto, brag before that they won the election while running from the opposition. So how much more now that they are within government? So, of course, there would be suspicions around the machinations that the government might be involved in. However, for me, Sophia, this whole thing has to come down to two things. One, the audit of the voter register, because that, going back to your statement, will be the silver bullet that fixes that. But the other important thing is that after this process of registering voters for the last time, IEBC is expected to publish the voter register in all the 44,000 polling stations across the country, and each individual voter is supposed to go there to confirm their details. So that, I think, those two processes, if handled well, will eliminate all forms of, suspicions and all ineligible voters within the voter register.
Yeah, and you talk about the importance of that audit of the voters register, and some of the criticism going towards the opposition is that when the process began, they moved to court to stop it, saying that KPMG, had no experience, quote unquote, and as far as conducting such an exercise. So one would then say, now what then do we do? If even when the exercise had been put in place to, at least they were never given a chance to take off, and then the findings then were contested. Yeah,
well, okay, fine. So there's no problem with anyone contesting anything in this country. We're a very judicious country. People are always running into court to bring up all manner of issues. So to that extent, it's within their their right to raise these issues. But I think for me, what was the most important element of what CORD raised in that court case was the criteria of doing the audit.
Right.
Because I think out of any auditing process, there's going to be an agreed upon criteria, which will be the score against which we will look at all the things that will go into the process. So really on that score alone, I believe that was the right thing. I hope the issues are expedited as quickly as possible so that we can move the process forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles Wafula, political analyst, for joining us here on News Center. And you're watching News Center. Thank you for staying with us. We take